This is the perfect manga for anyone who loves horror stories and loves science fiction. It's a new series called Mad, and the best way I can describe it is if you took Fire Punch and put aliens in it. And I mean literally aliens like the movie Alien. At first glance, it kinda just looks like Jujutsu Kaisen. And it does look like Chainsaw Man too. But the more you read Mad, the more you realize it's one of the most unique stories out right now. The creator Yusuke Otori takes a minimalist approach to the art style, but draws in a gritty way that almost feels more like a Western series like The Walking Dead. Combine that with a story that's emotionally gripping and always keeps you guessing, and you get one of the most thrilling manga you will ever read. Not to mention, it starts out with a first chapter that is 125 pages long, which is practically unheard of. I've read some series where the first chapter is like maybe 90 pages, but 125 is insane, which speaks to how great the beginning of this story is. We start on what is described as a futuristic Earth before it's suddenly attacked by aliens. For all we know, they're basically just xenomorphs, but everyone calls them aliens. Anyway, the aliens completely devastate the population, leaving the planet a desolate wasteland. Then we fast forward and meet John. John is a character that is clearly tired, clearly beaten, and clearly depressed. Now, John is more or less our self-insert. He has a cute sister Emma who's always smiling and putting a positive spin on things. And he runs around with a group of survivors who are all good at different things. Like, for example, one of the characters is a really good cook. One of the characters was a teacher, and John and Emma worked on a farm. Except, while Emma really enjoyed the farm life, John was never too crazy about it. And he went from that to walking around in the middle of nowhere with no home, barely any food, and the constant threat of being eaten alive by aliens. So you can kind of understand why John is so depressed. But when we meet him, John and his friends have this tracker. And the tracker is picking up a signal which the characters decide to seek out in the hope of finally finding shelter. Now, from here, I need to be very careful about what I do mention and what I don't mention, because this story ramps up fast. And like I said, this first chapter is 125 pages and a lot happens. So without going into too much detail, basically what happens is we find out this signal was actually coming from a remote evacuation shelter by the name of Jericho. And while it seems great at first, it's not long before John finds out that there's clearly something wrong with Jericho and the crazy soldiers that all call it home. Now, this story sounds a lot like the movie Alien. And at first, it kinda looks like Jujutsu Kaisen, but if you've read it before, then this manga feels shockingly similar to Fire Punch. But before I explain why that is, make sure to become a channel member if you're enjoying the video so far. You get exclusive perks like custom emojis and loyalty badges, and you can pick which manga I cover next. But like I was saying, the whole time I was reading Mad, I kept thinking to myself, wow, this is literally just Fire Punch with aliens. In Fire Punch, you have Agni, who doesn't really have a unique personality or motivation, but loves his sister and is motivated by her telling him to live on in this messed up, apocalyptic world. And in Mad, you have John, a relatively bland character with no motivation of his own, but is always thinking of his sister that tells him to live on in this horrifying alien apocalypse. I know this sounds a bit reductive, but this story starts out a lot like Fire Punch and hits a lot of the same beats. Another example is the soldiers in Jericho. In Fire Punch, you have the army of the blessed, and they're all whacked out of their mind, and there's this whole hierarchy. When John arrives at Jericho, he finds out that it's being used by survivors from the military, and at first they seem really friendly, but the whole time you're watching them, you just can't shake this feeling that something doesn't feel quite right. So on the one hand, Mad feels a lot like a new spin on Fire Punch, but on the other hand, I actually find myself liking Otori's spin on things a bit more. So to use our soldier example again, the army in Fire Punch is very clearly not good. Like, they do provide shelter, but they're complete assholes and there's nothing really justifiable about them. The soldiers in Mad are different. In Mad, they actually help John. They don't beat him up or call him trash. and they do genuinely invite him into their little family. Don't get me wrong, it's certainly not paradise and things are pretty messed up, but it's a lot more ambiguous. Like, it's messed up, but in this alien apocalypse, I can see how they justify a lot of the stuff they do. This is generally how I feel about John and Emma as well. In Fire Punch, Agni and Luna have a complicated relationship to say the least. But Agni is this sort of empty character that's basically haunted by his sister. Mad handles this somewhat differently. First of all, their relationship is not complicated, so there's that. But like we talked about with the soldiers, the dynamic here is a bit more nuanced. So in Fire Punch, Agni was on the verge of death when Luna told him to live, and then he spends like 3 years burning alive. That's not so good. In Mad, Emma is always telling John to live, but she also puts a positive spin on things and genuinely motivates John to look for the light at the end of the tunnel. So on the one hand, her presence has a somewhat haunting element to it, but on the other hand, her motivating influence actually saves John, and it helps him grow as a character and find his own motivation. So to that extent, Mad does feel a bit more nuanced than Fire Punch. Fire Punch is a complicated and layered story that you can get a different takeaway every time you read it. But there's just something about the way Otori writes these characters where it feels less in your face, and there's slightly more ambiguity in the story, which is fitting because at the same time, this is as much of a mystery series as it is a horror story. While you're deciding how you feel about these characters, you're also following John across the wasteland and deeper into the levels of Jericho, as he discovers what the military is really up to. So as thrilling as this story is, it's also an engaging story that encourages you to wrestle with each character, and rewards you for piecing together each mystery. Now Fire Punch is a complete series, and Mad isn't even a year old, so I'm not trying to say one series is better than the other. But I can say that despite the fact that these chapters are all like 40 to 60 pages long, I binged the whole series in one sitting because it's just that good. It's a familiar story, but Otori puts a refreshing spin on a lot of these tropes. And he also takes a similar approach to the art style. Like I said before, Mad looks a lot like other manga. For example, here is one of the more recent chapters of Jujutsu Kaisen, and here is a panel of John. Now, you can see there are some similarities. They both have kind of a flat look. Otori, like Gewgle, tends to draw in these thick outlines and polygonal shapes. Because of this, Mad will often have a sort of rough look like Jujutsu Kaisen. But once I got into this series, I realized it looks a lot like Fujimoto's work. Like, here's a panel of Emma, right? And if you've read Chainsaw Man, you're probably thinking, wow, that looks exactly like Reze. And that's because these two panels look very similar. Like, shockingly similar. They both have the simple smile with the blushed expression, the black hair with all the curls and messy bangs. And as you read Mad, you start to see how Otori puts subtle yet intricate details into the expressions of each character. So in a lot of ways, the characters also feel like something out of Chainsaw Man or Fire Punch because of these expressions. That being said, I think this comparison only fits for the characters. As far as the scenery goes, it's fairly simple and oftentimes there's just empty space, which isn't really what Fujimoto does because all his backgrounds are incredibly detailed. And I know, the assistants do it. It's not Fujimoto, it's the assistants. Well, whatever, it's still his manga, so shut up. Plus, Fujimoto will often push the limits when it comes to paneling, making full use of the medium. Otori, on the other hand, keeps the paneling and sequencing just as simple as the art. So visually, Mad does seem to borrow from Gewgle and Fujimoto, but as we've discussed, it's also got a lot of its own quirks that deliver an art style that, like the story, feels familiar while also delivering something that's clearly new. Again, I wish I could show more examples of the art, but because this manga has a big cliffhanger in every chapter, I would basically be spoiling the entire story. For now, all I can say is that the story is amazing and the art is incredibly satisfying. So much so that you don't even realize how long the chapters spoilers are before you're binging the series. As a matter of fact, this is my only criticism, namely that the series is only 18 chapters long at the time of recording this video. First of all, MAD only started last summer, so it's not even a year old. On top of that, this is a Jump Plus series. So while you do have a lot of series like Dawn to Dawn that mostly keep to a weekly schedule, MAD is kind of on and off. Sometimes it's consistent, and sometimes you'll go like 2 or 3 weeks without a chapter. I'm fairly new to the series, but it seems like it tends to drop 2 chapters every month, which is totally understandable considering each chapter is usually like 40 pages. That being said, while I highly recommend this manga, it does come with a side note. Again, without any spoilers, where we are in the story right now is kind of a cliffhanger. It's hard to say if we're in the middle of an arc or about to start a new one. Especially considering how much happens with each chapter, I can't make any guarantees. The bottom line is that if this manga sounds like something you'd be interested in, then I recommend checking it out right now. But if you would rather let it cook and flesh out beyond 18 chapters, then you may want to wait. That much is entirely up to you. But for now, what I can guarantee is that MAD is one of my favorite new manga, and I cannot wait to see how this story develops and how John grows as a great character. But now I'd like to hear what you think. What was your first impression of MAD? How would you describe the series? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you enjoyed the video, then make sure to become a channel member. You'll get exclusive perks like custom emojis and loyalty badges, and you can even pick which manga I cover next. Also, make sure to check out my other manga reviews, which you can find in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.